Welcome everyone to the Evidence Hour, Social Reactions to Sexual Assault. The Center for Victim Research is holding these Evidence Hour webinars to showcase broad reviews that examine an issue of importance to victim service providers, advocates, researchers, and allies. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Sarah Ullman is Professor of Criminology, Law, and Justice, and an affiliate professor of psychology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She is a social psychologist whose research concerns the impact of sexual assault on women's well-being. Kris Bein is the Assistant Director for the Research Sharing Project, where she provides training and technical assistance to state coalitions and rural rape crisis centers on sexual assault services, agency structure, and capacity building. She holds a master's degree in human services from the University of Illinois. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Ullman and Kris Bein.
I see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that very nice introduction, and I'm very excited to be here to be talking about my research on social reactions to sexual assault. So let me just start with a few things many of you may already be aware of, just some basic national statistics about sexual assault. 1 out of 5 women are raped in their lifetime, according to the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey data, and approximately 91% of victims are female. And most assaults by known persons are by known persons to the victim, and don't include additional physical injuries beyond the sexual assault itself. A majority of women survivors experience both short and long-term impacts of sexual assault, including PTSD symptoms, depression symptoms, as well as poorer health outcomes. Okay, my slide's not moving forward. Hang on one sec. Okay. Sorry about that. And in terms of disclosure and help seeking, national data also show that 2/3 to 80% of victims eventually tell somebody about the assault. Usually it's an informal source, such as family, partner, spouse, or friend, but most do not report to the police. And 1 in 5 victims seek medical services or some kind of health care related to the assault. In one study, almost 2/3 sought help from various formal sources at some point after the assault: mental health, or medical related sources, or religious sources. This slide actually just gives a little bit of an introduction of this concept of social reactions. And I think somebody in one of the comments that was sent out earlier talked about sort of, asking about kind of what those were, where they came from, where do these, the origin, and so I just sort of wanted to say that in my research, I've defined social reactions to disclosures as things people do and say in response to disclosures of sexual assault, but obviously there's a much wider context here, and these kinds of reactions come from larger rape myths and culture in our society, which are typically based on gender inequality and stereotypes about gender and sexuality. Not to plug my book, but I did write a book in 2010 actually about this that's got broader information called Talking About Sexual Assault, Society's Response to Survivors. I'm actually revising and updating it now. So, there's a lot more research on this now than there used to be. So just in general, some of the types of kinds of responses that people make in response to a disclosure or finding out about a sexual assault include, of course, negative responses, but also positive responses. And for some general categories, I'm just going to mention now, and there are many specific categories of these I've identified in research, as have others. There's the negative reactions of what I call turning against reactions, sort of active negative responses, most classically victim blame, this is your fault kind of responses. There are other negative reactions, though, that aren't quite as overt, and we term these in this larger category unsupportive acknowledgement. These are kind of where the person acknowledges that you've said something to them, like you've disclosed this information about the trauma, but they don't respond supportively, or maybe they don't even respond at all. Like silence, in fact, can be not surprisingly viewed as a negative reaction. So I give an example there of distraction, right? If you're sort of trying to take somebody's mind off it or change the subject and not engage with them about what they just told you. And then there are, of course, positive reactions, things like, comforting and listening and, emotional support. Now, why are these reactions important? Because they affect outcomes or recovery outcomes of survivors that I was talking about earlier. And in particular, receiving more of these negative social reactions from other people that you tell about sexual assault are pretty strongly correlated with greater symptomatology, more PTSD symptoms, more depressive symptoms, an increase in self-blame, which survivors may already be experiencing, but also things like problem drinking. And this is statistical information that I'm giving you, that this is just statistical associations of receiving these reactions with these outcomes. On the positive side, statistical associations of did you receive and how many positive reactions did you get to your disclosure, those tend to show a weak positive or no statistically significant relationship to recovery outcomes. This doesn't mean that positive reactions are bad. I just want to emphasize that. It just means that in these kinds of quantitative analyses, they don't come out as strongly predicting those kinds of, sort of psychopathology, sort of negative outcomes. In fact, they do show relationships to more positive outcomes, and we'll talk about that as well. But most of the problem, I would argue, is these negative reactions that survivors get.
Yeah, Sarah, if I can add something here. For everyone in the audience who works at an advocacy program of some type, this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important for us to include significant others in our advocacy. There's so much good that we can do as advocates in providing individual support to the survivor. But if you're also doing just a little bit of training with the survivor's parents or their sorority, the other folks that might be important to them, you can just do so much good by helping those closest to the survivor not say the wrong thing and try to say the right thing. And I find for most folks, they love the person who was sexually assaulted and they want to do the right thing. But because of the bad rape myths we have in society and just our general discomfort with human sexuality, what starts as caring often gets kind of warped and misdirected on the way from their heart to their mouth. And they might say the wrong thing.
Exactly. Thank you, Kris. Yeah, I completely agree. Intentionally or unintentionally, right? Yeah, so just the impetus, as Susan said at the beginning about this for this webinar, was this recent article that I published, a systematic review of research on social reactions, studies that have been done. And actually it was disclosures of not just sexual assault, I've abbreviated here, SA, and also intimate partner violence or IPV disclosures in this literature. It's not that big, but it's growing. And I've just got some bullet points of some of the major findings that we found across these 30 studies in this review. And you can sort of see the different kinds of factors that were related to receiving more negative and more positive. And in particular, we found that, and keep in mind this is correlational, not causal, so I just want to make that statement here, that studies seem to show that Black and Hispanic survivors, less educated survivors, those who indicated a bisexual orientation, sexual orientation, seem to say, self-report that they got more of these negative social reactions when they disclosed the assault. Those with trauma histories of other kinds of traumas, not just the sexual assault, either in childhood or adulthood, also reported receiving more of these negative social reactions across these studies. Interestingly, specific assault characteristics of the sexual assault, that is, were not statistically related to receiving more of these negative social reactions in this review of studies. And we also found that survivors with more psychological symptoms who were blaming themselves more, and those who are engaging in more avoidance forms of coping, either blocking it out, using substances to cope, other kinds of avoidant coping, they all also reported receiving more negative social reactions from other people. I also want to mention a really important one here is this notion of perception of control, and I'm sure many of you are aware, but one of the biggest traumatic aspects of sexual assault, including the physical aspect of, the violence, but it's also the loss of control and the taking away of control of the survivors, really a very intimate loss of control. And so this is really a factor that's important to be restored in survivors, right, in terms of their empowerment and recovery. And what we see here is that survivors perceiving less control, and I'm going to say control over their present recovery process. It's not control over if the rape happened or not in the past, and it's not control over, will I get assaulted again in the future, but right now, my control over recovery, that, and saying that they had felt they had grown less following the assault, or had less what's called post-traumatic growth, sort of positive forms of growth, both also had received more negative social reactions. And finally, those who've told more people, and in particular who've told both formal and informal sources, also report receiving more negative social reactions. That's largely driven by the formal sources, which are overwhelmingly, almost all of them, not exactly all of them, report worse and more negative social reactions than informal, but they can come from both. This is also partly just an artifact of the more people that you tell, the more sources that you tell, your greater odds that you're going to get a negative response. Positive social reactions were also associated with disclosure characteristics, aspects of the timing of disclosure, and the detailed level of the disclosure and other aspects we have found to be related to outcomes for survivors. Telling informal sources, as I was just alluding to, seems to yield more positive reactions, not necessarily uniformly, but is more likely to. Particular female friends for women survivors tend to be rated most positively in responding to sexual assault. And then telling more sources was related to more positive. Again, that's just because telling more sources is related to telling more positive and more formal and informal. I'm not going to talk so much about intended. There is some research, and I covered in the review about hypothetical. What would I do if somebody disclosed to me, and asking students or others, how would you respond to a disclosure? So there is some information in there also about that. Just, unless you have any comment, Kris, I just want to move on to talk about my study.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to talk about a study I did that started in 2010, went through 2016. It was a large study that involved a 3-year annual longitudinal survey, so survivors taking surveys over 3 years, and then there were follow-up interviews, both with survivors and an informal support source. So it's a very large study, and as you can see, there were over 1,800 women with unwanted sexual experiences at age 14 or older that they had told someone about previously. They disclosed this assault. It was in adulthood. That was an artifact of the measure that it's age 14 of the state where it's developed, so that's kind of arbitrary. But these were all considered adult sexual assault survivors, and they were on average 36 years old, but you can see a wide span. And there was a racially and ethnically diverse sample. This was a Chicago metro area sample. This is where I've done most of my research and been for my career. These demographics do not exactly match the demographics in the Chicago metro area at that time. It really overrepresented African American and underrepresented Hispanic, Latina, and or Asian survivors. And as you can see on the right there, there's a pretty even split. Most saying they had some college at the time. About a third a college degree or more, and 26% a high school degree or less. So as I said, these were women coming forth who were recruited via flyers, local newspaper ads, Craigslist, agencies such as agencies related to violence against women or mental health, women's oriented businesses, as well as local area colleges and universities. And this was ongoing recruitment over a year to get that initial sample of over 1,800 survivors. And we screened the women by phone for these criteria that I just mentioned before that they needed for eligibility of having an unwanted sexual experience at 14 or older, that they were 18 or older at the time of participating in our study, and that they had previously told at least one person about their experience. That was because the grant that this funded this was only about disclosure and reactions. We sent them through the mail study materials, an informed consent form, a community resources list, and we, of course, when they completed and returned their surveys, we paid them $25 each. What did we find? So just some basic descriptors here, you know, that most people, again, were women reported an experience with somebody that they knew, that it was an acquaintance, date, relative, or spouse. And most of these incidents, just over half, happened either in the woman's or the man's home. In this case, most of the perpetrators were men, but we did ask about gender of the perpetrator, which was pretty, we did get same gender perpetrators, so not a large number, but we did. Also alcohol use we asked about, and we found about half were drinking alcohol before the experience, and about a third, both the perpetrator and the woman, had been drinking at the time. And in 2 out of 10, only the woman had been drinking. This is pretty typical. Usually either both people are drinking, sometimes only the perpetrator is drinking, but it's less common for only the victim to be drinking at the time. We know this has a big impact, though, and the reason we're studying this also is because not all, but many assaults can happen in the context of alcohol or other substances. So we also found, in terms of impact, in the first year after the unwanted experience, and again, keep in mind, this is not a representative random survey or sample of individuals. This is people who came forward to participate in a study of unwanted sexual experiences. So after such an experience, women tended to blame themselves more in the immediate period post-assault, and this is common across research that's been done, saying that they felt they should have been more cautious or didn't do enough to protect themselves. And you know, again, this is not uncommon, and you know, we are socialized to be more cautious and vigilant and sort of gatekeeping, you know, themselves regarding risk of regarding sexual matters, but sexual assault as well. Now, those who said they had the assault longer in the past, right, because it is varied in our sample, let's say 5 or more years ago, compared to those who had the experience more recently in the past year, seem to have recovered more from the experience, and this isn't surprising. We do see a lot of recovery, right, just spontaneous recovery among victims and trauma survivors more generally, I should say. What was related to feeling more recovered? Well, the more things that they felt they could do to make themselves feel better, whether that was self-care or coping, more drawing on spiritual practices, either a strong religious faith or cultivating of spirituality in other ways, as well as cultivating and finding personal strength, you know, even in the face of the aftermath of the assault, and feeling that they had learned better how to handle difficulties and realize that they were stronger than they thought they were. And this is, again, over time. So I told you that the people eligible for this had to have told somebody in the past, but as you can see, 87% had told someone when we actually asked them that question on the survey. And in fact, there was a small proportion who had not told somebody. And so that was an interesting thing to find. And in most of my research before this study, I didn't even ask that question. Maybe not as clear to people, you know, necessarily what a disclosure was or what counted potentially for that. Obviously, the data I'm talking about on disclosure and reactions is the ones who did tell someone. And approximately a third of women told somebody immediately after, but 1/3 waited till a year or more later. And we see across samples that there is this large variation in when people disclose sexual assault, right? They don't all tell soon afterwards, weeks or even months afterwards. Some do, but some don't. And then sometimes, you know, it's within a year, and then others, it can be many years. And this is only of those that we even identify, right, in research or other ways that ever talk about it at all. So that's important to keep in mind. Women were most likely to tell a friend, and almost as likely to tell a romantic partner in this study. They were least likely to tell clergy. Of the different informal and formal sources. We asked about a range of those in the survey.
Sarah, if I can just add one thing about that timing of disclosure. I've observed in my practice, because of kind of all the bad information out in society about sexual assault, and as I mentioned before, we have a just general discomfort with sexuality in the U.S. I find for a lot of survivors, it takes a while for someone to wrap their head around what happened and to be able to name it. And for a disclosure to happen, you have to have the words for what happened. And oftentimes, survivors are stuck in a place of shock and kind of slowly putting their thoughts together of like, well, this bad thing happened, or I didn't like how that went. And then as time goes on, they start putting more understanding around it and then are able to tell someone about it. I think also many survivors, as all humans do with hard things, many folks believe like, if I just stop thinking about it, I'll be fine. And obviously, if I tell someone, that means I'm thinking about it. So I'm just not going to think about it. And then a year later, or sometimes more, they realize that strategy is not, in fact, working for them.
Yes, I would agree exactly. Yeah, with that unacknowledgement or what sometimes we call it not self-labeling, just that right, it evolves over time, and it depends on the nature of the experience and response from other people. Sometimes can even help people to do that. And I think one of the interesting things, I'm going a little off here, but just that is just because it's not acknowledged, right, doesn't mean, as you were just saying, Kris, it doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact, right? If only we could just block something out and then it wouldn't affect us, but that just doesn't work. So I think that's really important to say, and also, as you said, to understand in terms of why is this so, it takes so long sometimes for people to even realize what's happened and to tell anyone about it. So thank you. So let me just move into a little bit more findings of these three. If you look at those bars at the bottom of positive, turning against, and unsupportive acknowledgement reactions that I talked about earlier, and at the top in bold, there's sort of some examples of those three types. And so we were looking at how do these three types of reactions relate to, that survivors got from others they told, to other kinds of responses that they had. So these positive ones, like listening, belief, and emotional support, again, this is statistical analyses here, were related to increased perceived control over one's own recovery, as well as an increase or more engagement in both positive as well as maladaptive or negative, you don't have to label it, but that's sort of the term we use, forms of coping. So more of all types of coping, good and bad, as well as less depressive symptoms. In terms of the overt sort of blaming type, turning against type reactions, right, as well as things like being stigmatized or infantilizing responses, being treated like a child, having people pull away from you, these type of things. These were related to survivors increasing their level of social withdrawal from other people, not surprisingly, and blaming themselves more. They were also related to a decrease in sexual assertiveness in sexual situations and or with partners. And a little bit different, these other negative type of reactions, the unsupportive acknowledgement, somebody hears it, but they don't really respond supportively, such as distraction, controlling reactions, or egocentric responses. And again, by controlling it, you can just be taking control of your decisions, telling you what to do, or egocentric can sort of be like almost reacting as if the disclosure is about you, not about that person. So for example, maybe a mom saying to her teen daughter, oh my God, how could you have done this to us, right? Like as if it's about the mom, not about the daughter. And so those unsupportive acknowledgement reactions are related to more positive individual forms of coping, things one can do as an individual. And then as opposed to sort of social forms of coping, as well as increased maladaptive coping, such as, trying to disengage or block it out, using substances, and maybe other self-harming behaviors even. And these reactions were also related to more depressive symptoms and to greater PTSD symptoms. So my initial thought that blame is the worst thing that can happen, I was kind of wrong. Like, those aren't good. They do lead to negative outcomes, but so do these sort of, maybe more overt, potentially more benign, or what I thought might be more benign social reactions are still quite harmful. So I'm going to move to talk a little bit about the alcohol piece. I have a standardized scale to measure these social reactions. By the way, it's 45 items long. It's the social reactions questionnaire. I don't know how many people are interested in that, but I also have a battery of questions about if the assault involved drinking, and the disclosure involved that, and why, because we do tend to hold victims more responsible if they were drinking, and victims tend to also engage in a lot of self-blame for these types of incidents. And so I looked at these positive and negative, what I call positive and negative alcohol-specific reactions, things people would say or do in response to that kind of disclosure. Either the person hearing it knew alcohol was involved, or the survivor told them that alcohol was involved. So an example would be, just because you were drinking, doesn't mean it's your fault, or this shouldn't have happened to you just because you were drinking, would be a positive example, just to summarize informally. And then a negative one would be something like, you shouldn't have been drinking, right? This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't done that. So that's a negative. And what we found, interestingly, was that receiving more of the positive alcohol reactions led to less characterological self-blame, sort of a good thing. What is that character of blame? It's blaming myself as a person, less blaming myself that I'm just a bad person. This is why this happens to me. It's my fault. I'm fundamentally flawed or damaged or something. So that was interesting, because we thought that this kind of thing, like alcohol drinking, something you could maybe change in behavior, would actually be leading to less blame of one's own behavior. There's these sort of two types of self-blame studied in the literature, but it didn't. It was related to blaming one's character more, but also receiving more of the negative ones, the more blaming for alcohol ones, were related, this isn't so surprising, to more increased problem drinking in survivors, as well as increased characterological self-blame. Why is that blaming oneself as a person so bad? Because that's a hard thing to change, and because that's very strongly related to PTSD in the research on sexual assault. Okay. So just a little bit more about teasing out a little more on these other social reaction findings that we found in this study. I mentioned controlling reactions earlier, and part of what I had in this scale about controlling reactions from other people, where they take charge or try to tell you what to do after the assault, these negative responses, was what we termed infantilizing reactions, sort of treating you like you're incompetent or you're like your child. And in one of our papers that came out of this research, we found that it wasn't just controlling reactions in general, it was specifically ones that were infantilizing to the survivor that led to survivors feeling less perceived control over their own recovery, which was also associated with increased PTSD and problem drinking. So anything that undermines control, particularly making them feel small, like they can't do anything for themselves, they're not capable, is really harmful.
Sarah, it's also interesting to me, well, first of all, there's so much to talk about with choice and control. But I also just want to note with the infantilizing reactions, with most sexual assault happening before the survivor is 24, it's also just interesting to me that we're talking about oftentimes sexual violence against teens and college age young adults, where I've certainly seen in my practice a lot of parents go overboard in trying to protect their kid by basically walling them inside the house, which then for most teenagers is perceived as very infantilizing, and then reinforces all the fears that you have about the outside world. I did my advocacy work in a college town, and I worked with a lot of survivors whose parents made them drop out of school and move home. And that's incredibly damaging to your self-efficacy. You know, you had gone to college, moved away from home for the first time, starting to learn how to be an adult, and then a terrible thing happens, and your parents say, "Nope, you're a kid. You can't live on your own anymore."
Yes, yes. And there are, you know, as you already know, there are things that can be done that are empowering and supportive. I mean, it's an understandable response, I would say, but right, we know from, and my early research was on resistance to sexual assault way back when I did my dissertation, my early research, and there's actually, you know, good research showing that, you know, there are positive kinds of forms of strengthening oneself. Obviously, things like feminist and empowerment self-defense training, that is even with girls, not just with women. And this has been shown in a lot of good research by Dr. Charlene Sen, that's one thing that can really, really help to gain self-confidence, as well as to gain some knowledge about how to set one's boundaries, and also how to necessarily resist if one necessarily needs to do that. And so I think there are other ways to respond to that, but yeah, that's definitely behavioral restriction, right? And we don't need to be told this after COVID, right? And feeling like one has to, you know, shrink one's world in is really harmful. And one of the things that women do a lot, right? And people do after assault as a reaction to that as well, just for that, for self-protection, when really we want people to be empowered and not to feel that they have to do that, which may actually lead to other kind of worse consequences. So, so thank you. So just the last thing here on this slide before I move on is just that those, again, who get more negative social reactions and have more symptoms of PTSD also report decreased post-traumatic growth. And, you know, we think of this post-traumatic growth as, you know, a lot of the early research in clinical and other work focused on, you know, psychopathology in victims, right? You have all these things wrong with you. You've got symptoms, you've got health issues, as opposed to sort of what are the positives? Because most often there's a lot of positive there too, or possibilities for that. And so this is where strengths-based, right, and empowerment approaches can be really important, not to deny the assault, to deal with the trauma and treat it, but also to reinforce the strength and positive. And what we found in looking at this scale, this measure of self-reported growth after the traumatic event in this study, was that things like receiving positive reactions from others, perceiving control over one's own recovery, greater control, as well as engaging in adaptive forms of individual coping, or maybe self-care, exercise, you know, other kinds of things. As well as what we call disrupted core beliefs. There's sort of in the trauma literature research and theory about that, you know, in order to grow, that you have this disruption that can happen from trauma of beliefs, core beliefs about yourself, others, in the world. And that can not only lead to post-traumatic stress symptoms, but it also can lead to, with appropriate support and help and efforts by survivors, to also greater post-traumatic growth. So it's not sort of like we have survivors who are either, you know, completely damaged and totally symptomatic, or really, really doing great and totally they've grown. In fact, these things can be all different patterns and co-occur even. I want to shift gears, just in the interest of time, to talk about this second part of this study. What I was telling you about was our survey data that I mentioned from this large study. We moved on at the end of 3 years of doing surveys with the sexual assault survivors to ask those who had done all those surveys if they wanted to do an interview to better understand their experience of disclosure and talking to another person in their informal, you know, network. In this case, a family, friend, or significant others. And we asked them also to refer us to another person in their life that they had told. And we basically interviewed survivors and then interviewed a person who they had told. Obviously, both interviews were confidential, and we did 90 interviews. These were qualitative interviews of these 45 pairs, sort of matched pairs of survivors and their, what we called, supporters. And we just wanted to find what else went on there in terms of the responses they got or impacts of the disclosure. And we found a few themes here I just want to mention. Not that surprisingly maybe, but we found in some of these pairs, the family ones involving parent-child relationships, for example, when the parent told the child about the assault or the child found out, that there was a response of sort of a parentification effect where children felt obligated to take on adult or parenting responsibilities before they were ready to do so. You see this in addiction as well, not just in violence. I'm sure this also dynamic occurs in domestic violence, or witnessing it as well for kids. And then there was also a theme, and so that was sort of unique to the family, parent-child relationship type family relationship that we found in these interviews. The role of past trauma, right? Being better able to respond to survivors because of getting it by having one's own experience with trauma, maybe sexual assault or some other kind of trauma. And we found, about half reported this. It didn't even have to be the same trauma. There were some men I can remember interviewing who their mom had been assaulted and they knew about it and they were trying to support their mom. And it could have been a sexual assault, but also they could have witnessed domestic violence in the home as well. And so they understood sexual assault, like now with a current partner who disclosed to them because of what they experienced growing up in a violent family. Betrayal trauma was another one. And in this case, and remember, we interviewed these survivors and then we interviewed the supporter about the experience of disclosing and or hearing about the assault separately. And in this case, some of the survivors said that the supporter, the SP that I've abbreviated there, or support provider, had violated the survivor's trust or well-being. This sort of goes beyond these negative reactions I've mentioned. And this was re-victimizing to the survivor, as well as even at least temporarily to that relationship between the two. Now, clearly the relationship had gotten better by the time these interviews happened, or those people probably wouldn't have been participating in the interview. Now, the supporters didn't necessarily recognize damage by that, right? So they weren't talking about that, or maybe didn't realize that for whatever reason. Examples of this could be telling other people, but without the survivor's permission. So these were some other interesting themes that came out that were a little bit more relational in some ways, and I think were very important. So there's broader things going on, obviously, than just these social reactions. What was the effect of the impact on these supporters? In our interviews, when we asked them that, how was this for you? What kinds of effects did this have on you? And they reported various feelings, but not just negative feelings of sadness, triggering anger responses at hearing about this, that it had happened to the survivor, but also being inspired and honored at the survivors trusting them enough to tell them and let them, in some cases, help them and support them. Some of the supporters also said they reported active cognitive and behavioral impacts to disclosure. And this can be things like not feeling safe oneself, or just sort of suddenly feeling vulnerable as well. Like, well, if this could happen to my friend, it could happen to me too. And even behavioral impacts paralleling the survivor's reaction. We sometimes call this like vicarious trauma reactions that people who work with trauma survivors also can have in terms of withdrawing or showing behavioral restriction and other kinds of responses that may parallel those of even survivors as well. And some of these cognitive impacts or changes in one's beliefs about the world or goodness of others, things like that, led to various positive and negative behaviors in relation to the survivor. The supporters said in some cases they avoided the survivor, at least temporarily, not kind of knowing how to deal with it. Sometimes they engaged in caretaking of the survivor, and then in other cases they set sort of a focus on educating others about this issue or intervening when they encountered problematic situations. So a variety of effects. Did they seek help, we asked them, to cope with the emotional weight of the disclosure, right? There's a lot of research on survivors is less on supporters, and so we really wanted to look at this. And we found about half sought help from somebody other than the survivor, and you can sort of see there about a third from a formal source, less than a third from informal, and even less from both types of sources. So some, but not all, did seek help. But almost half didn't seek help to cope with the disclosure. And they have various reasons. Some just didn't feel there was an impact and that they didn't feel they needed to talk to anyone else. Interestingly, some of the survivors that we interviewed who were in the same pairs as those individuals, the supporters, said they felt the supporter actually was being quite impacted by their disclosure and that they felt they needed help. That supporter did.
Sarah, I also think it's interesting here, like how much to really stress how much supporters need and are looking for help for themselves. And I think, unfortunately, oftentimes formal sources of support, instead of providing help to the person in front of them, you know, the sister or the friend or the boyfriend of the survivor, sometimes those formal sources of support instead become really fixated on how can you get the survivor in here so I can help them directly. And see the survivor's loved one as an avenue to get support to the survivor, instead of seeing that loved one as a person who needs support in their own right.
Yes, makes complete sense to me. But right, they do need help and they can be uniquely helpful. Yes, no, thank you for that point. I think it's really important. And, you know, so in addition to that, some again didn't think it was necessarily needed that they seek help to cope with the disclosure. Some were really concerned. They know they would never tell anyone else. This would be violating the survivor's trust. That was just not okay to do. And many were unaware that formal sources could actually assist them. For example, right, we hear about rape crisis. We know, oh, well, rape crisis is for the rape victim. It's not for anybody else. In fact, there may be support available and there's definitely a need for it. But, you know, supporters often express like they don't want to take any attention away from the survivor or focus off her and her help seeking. And so I think sometimes can put their needs aside. And I can tell you I remember some interviews done with supporters where by the end of the interview, they were sort of like, oh, no, I didn't seek help. I didn't need any. And by the end of the interview, we're somehow, you know, I'm thinking maybe I should be talking to somebody about this, even sometimes years later. So supporters, I agree, need support. Not everyone maybe, but many may. And services that are geared to them to help them and where they can discuss the impact on them, especially if it's an intimate relationship or family relationship, even a close friend, and be validated for their own feelings and thoughts and experience of this, which can be complicated depending on the situation. Okay, so what do we need? What do survivors think we need? In these interviews, we asked them sort of at the end of the interview, what do you think is needed? We got data actually from the surveyed survivors and from these interviewed folks about what they thought. I don't have the supporter information, but I have it on my notes if people want to hear that as well. And survivors basically said, you know, tell somebody, don't keep it to yourself or isolate. And that telling people who seem safe and supportive, you know, selective disclosure, having discretion, someone who has training or personal experience with trauma is really what is needed. And it doesn't have to be a formal source, right? So a support source with specialized knowledge, whether that's somebody who really gets this because they've been through it. And I'll just add that this isn't on the slide, but we also asked supporters this question, and supporters said that there was a need for supporters to allow survivors to talk about their experience, right, to just create that space for them to be heard. And they emphasized active and non-distracted and non-interrupted listening as being key, right, just to listen, not even important necessarily to be saying stuff or doing something about it. Several supporters were cautious about making recommendations for providing support, acknowledging that positive support can manifest itself differently for every individual. And I didn't talk about this, but there's the social reaction and there's also the perception of the reaction, right? Depending on the person and relationship you have, something that may sound like a really negative thing, they may know your intention is to be helpful and take it positively. So it's more complicated. And we do look at things like mixed sort of social reactions where you might be getting something positive and negative even in the same response. It's more complicated than what I've said here. And so this is something we need to look at more in future research, supporters said to us, and take into consideration when developing information and or training for potential people who might hear a disclosure. Survivors also wanted more education for young people. As Kris mentioned, you know, most assaults happen against very young people. in not just young women, but also when assaulted and sexual assault often can happen to young boys or young men as well, and more training for law enforcement and other formal support providers. Key that is that advocacy groups really need to include, of course, survivor input, all of us do, and planning and community outreach and education. And we do too when we're doing right research and prevention. So this is by no means exhaustive, but just a couple of things from my own research that I pull out that additional research is needed on. I mean, we do need more research on alcohol-related sexual assaults and social reactions to the disclosures of these assaults. We don't have as much work on them. Some of my own work and some of my doctoral students is ongoing in this area. We know it's very complicated, and these assaults are very difficult to deal with for various reasons, in the world, but also obviously in the criminal legal system. Underrepresented groups, right? We have more increasing all the time, but we still need more research on women of color, on immigrant survivors, on those who are sexual gender minorities, as well as those who are disabled. And again, this isn't exhaustive, but we really need more research on lots of different subgroups because this is a pretty widespread problem in society. And we do have some, but it's still limited, growing a small body of research on social media disclosures, right? There's a lot of, especially since Me Too and since Title IX enforcement, we have a lot more disclosure, public even, on social media, and we don't know quite as much about, my interest would be in how that affects survivors, how that affects them, others around them, and also how it relates to these types of disclosures, the sort of on-the-ground disclosures, right, to other people in the, kind of face-to-face or other kinds of ways that they've happened, prior to social media. So translation of research into practice is really important. In recent work, collaborating with others, I've done some of this or started to. Education and prevention to address these disclosure reactions and help, as well as help seeking, including information for supporters, including family, friends, and partners, where those relationships are quite different. Evaluating support network interventions, and we've developed one. Dr. Katie Edwards and I, she's at the University of Nebraska, developed a program, and I just have a little bit of information about it on the last slide, that is still being further refined. Obviously, we need dialogue between researchers and practitioners because otherwise we don't know the important research always that needs to be done, and that should be informed by those who are out in the field and who are doing this work every day with survivors. So just a little bit about that SSS program that we did, which was, again, a large sort of on-the-ground program. This was done before COVID on a university campus called Supporting Survivors in the Self, and it basically targeted those who might hear about a partner abuse disclosure or disclosure of sexual assault. And it was, again, a pretty intensive intervention that was co-facilitated and had various aspects that you can see there on the slide that we're including in this intervention. And it was trying to not only educate about sexual assault, but explain the disclosure process and give students some information about what are good things to say and do and what to avoid saying and doing, based on a lot of this research about social reactions. Also, information about body language, sort of do's and don'ts, nonverbal kinds of communication that survivors are very sensitive to that may have nothing to do with what's coming out of your mouth. And then special considerations, and this is not all of them, just a couple here. If the disclosure happens when somebody's, inebriated, under the influence, either one or both people, as well as if it's virtual disclosure, which is kind of very different, right? Depending on are you on the phone, are you online, are you face-to-face? That's a very different kind of context. And then a little bit about supporting oneself, how to manage one's emotions, how to take care of yourself, and not to leave the survivor, but to disengage when you need to from the issue and with healthy boundaries to take care of oneself, right? To be careful that you kind of don't go down with that other person, right? If they're really struggling, as well as to provide resources to supporters, not just to survivors. So I don't want to go on too much. That's pretty much all I had to present, and I'm so grateful to be here and to have all of you here and all of the input that you gave about research that's needed. Thank you so much for that, and I'll just let Kris or someone else chime in. Thank you so much.
Kris, before we go to questions, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, I think the thing that I kept seeing throughout Sarah's research, which is so incredibly helpful, your whole body of research is so great. But the thing that I kept seeing over and over was just the incredible importance of helping survivors regain control and choice in their lives. And I think for all the folks that are here today in all of the different professions that you represent, we should all be thinking about in each interaction with the survivor, how to help give them a sense of control and choice in everything that we do, because it clearly makes a difference. And I also just want to say again, like, how important it is to give support providers support of their own.
We've had quite a few questions come in. I'm actually going to start with the most recent because it's the practical one. And this is from Sylvia. Can you give examples of nonverbals to avoid?
I would say Kris may be, good or better at this about this too, but I would say, obviously you don't want to react with shock, right? But you also don't want to not react. And it can just be very much taking the cues from that person, pulling away from them physically, sort of averting one's gaze. I think these are the types of things that may sort of reveal, and they can be unconscious, right? We try our best, but it can be shocking when someone tells us this. But trying not to do that, right? Trying to be engaged, be looking at them, and not kind of engage in behaviors that sort of show how you're feeling, especially if it's kind of horrified or a reaction that might further distress them. I don't know what you think about that, Kris.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think disgust is really important to watch for and control. Like anything that could be interpreted as disgust is, I think, particularly hard for survivors. And the other one that I think is kind of unexpected is too much physical contact or crowding them, as my office assistant is demonstrating throughout this webinar. But I see a lot of significant others kind of want to like crush that survivor with a hug. And as Sarah was saying, watching body language, and if someone is backing away from you, don't keep moving in.
All right, folks, I want to remind you, you can enter your questions in the question tab. A question came in early from Caitlin, wondering if the dynamics of the assault, how the assault occurred, the details of the assault itself play a part into those who disclosed within the first year or years later. I don't know if that was part of your survey.
Yeah, I would say this, still, despite all this awareness that we have and information and how much more out there sexual assault is, there are still trends in the literature that show, that the more classic sort of sexual assaults by strangers, with or less known folks with weapons out on the street, right, not in one's home or a party or a date or whatever. That those are more likely, partly probably because of what Kris raised earlier, because they're more likely to be that, yes, this is a legitimate assault, right? He does this. So there's still those trends in the literature, even though those divisions between known and stranger assaults are less well known, it's kind of a continuum, are lower than they used to be. It's particularly difficult, right, with intimate partners, right, or those that are close to us. So there still definitely are assault characteristics that impact disclosure, who one tells, as does alcohol, right? Alcohol-related assaults as well. And survivors actually look, and I've done some research on this also and other work with these data, they actually sometimes try to vet their own experience. Is this a legitimate thing? And is this something that I can actually be telling others? And sometimes engage others around them. And do you really think this is something that's valid and that, that I should do something about, and question themselves, if it's important enough or if it matters, often given those circumstances that they make it, well, I went to his house, well, I was at this party, or I was drinking, or whatever, all these things that the society, unfortunately, can use to delegitimate survivors.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the policing of oneself, right? You know,
Yeah.
oh, I can't report, this isn't good enough or something, or I won't be believed, basically.
Absolutely.
Jayashri asked a question that I'm sure a lot of people were thinking about how much of this negative impact reaches the point of PTSD. You know, where in the negative impacts are you talking about victims who go on to have PTSD, or is it really nebulous?
Yeah, you know, some research shows that within the immediate period after sexual assault that about 1/3 of survivors have PTSD. Others may have PTSD symptoms, but at a lower level. And what we've seen in that research following survivors that are identified, you know, sort of sooner after the assault, is that, you know, many do recover spontaneously, but there can be, you know, 20 to 30% that don't, that may develop sort of chronic symptoms. So in my sample, it was variable, right? This is PTSD symptoms ranging from low, moderate to high. So they don't necessarily all qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. But in general, when you look at research, you know, representative sample research, random sample research, you'll find, you know, approximately 1/3 of survivors, especially if it's soon after the assault, may qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. This doesn't mean they'll always have that, but if you're talking about shortly after the assault, it is more likely that you'll see that. And certainly doesn't mean recovery won't happen. Even without treatment, there may be some, you know, some remission of those symptoms. It also depends on if you were traumatized earlier, right? If you have a history of child sexual abuse or other partner traumas, put you at higher risk of having that trauma reaction to a later assault.
We had some appreciation about your coverage of post-traumatic growth. We also had a question about that. Were you talking about mental growth, psychological growth, social growth, or a combination of those things? For those who are new to the idea of...
Yes, it's a combination of all of those things. It can be improved relationships with other people. It can be, you know, as I say, sort of cultivating a spiritual sense of oneself that, you know, or connection to even a higher power. Increase in gratitude, you know, often out of terrible things that happen to us, not always, but if we work on them, right, and get help, we can not only deal with the effects of the trauma, but also feel that we've grown in ways that maybe we wouldn't have even grown without that happening. Not to say it was a good thing. So it's lots of different dimensions are in there.
Mm-hmm. Can I add one thing about post-traumatic growth? This is kind of a nuance, but I think it's an important one. People often get casual in their language about many things, including post-traumatic growth. And I sometimes hear people say things like, you are stronger because you were raped, or the sexual violence made you stronger. No. The strength is not a gift that the perpetrator gives while they're sexually assaulting someone. That is not how it works. Humans have many innate strengths that we don't know about until we are put in various awful situations. And again, because we have so many practitioners here, I just want everyone to be really careful in their language when they're talking about the ways survivors grow and heal. None of that is because of the sexual violence. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you, Kris. Gina mentions that she created a support group for parents of sexual assault survivors because she saw such a need. Kris, do you have any suggestions, or have you seen some good programming by sexual assault services for supportive friends and family?
Yes, one of my favorites comes from the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. Their support group curriculum is called Circle of Hope, I believe, and they have a version of it for significant others. We've got a couple of other resources out there that, of course, I'm blanking on right now. I'll drop our website in the chat because I think we have a couple things on our website.
Great, thank you. Timothy asked a research question for Dr. Ullman. You detailed questions where there are gaps in the research and literature overall, but he is wondering what you would say about some of the limitations specific to the study that you just completed.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, one of them that I did sort of highlight is that this is research that's not on a random sample, right? So these are people who stepped up or volunteered to be in a study about unwanted sexual experiences. So the issue with that is, do you know if that's going to generalize to, all women or even women from the Chicago metro area who've experienced sexual assault? And there's no way to know that. So that's, a caveat that's important. The reason it's done on the volunteer convenience sample is because, one, it would cost 2 to 3 times more, and this is a federally funded grant, so that would be very, very expensive to identify survivors from the general population and then to target them and then to do a study of this scope or magnitude. So I would say that's the largest one. This was also, I didn't talk about the longitudinal or over time findings in the 3-wave surveys that we did, but we did do some of those analyses as well that we published to try to get at the directionality of some of the constructs. So it was a very strong study, but like all studies, it has limitations. It's also self-report data, right? It's survivors reporting in a survey and or interviews about their experience. So researchers see that as a limitation often in research as well.
Another question came in from Kylie. Do you think educating our communities on the typical responses of survivors to their assaults could help them better understand what to expect if they know a survivor and how to accept their personal reactions? What type of
yes, I do.
Training could we be doing?
Yes, I mean, I think that making clear to people sort of that a range of kind of styles and presentations can happen, and that I would say there's not necessarily one thing that someone would present with. Some people hide it very well and don't necessarily show kind of what's going on, through their behavior or their expression. So I don't know if that's what you're asking me. Some people may be very stressed and it may be very clear that something's happened and something's wrong. But I think just that there can be a variety of presentations, and you may not actually really know, even if it's somebody who's close to you, that this has happened. I think I would avoid stereotypes kind of, because I think about not just victims but perpetrators. Right? We would like to think, oh, we can tell what a person is like, right? That we can look at them or talk to them and know that they're a victim or a perpetrator. I'm going to say, this is just my N of 1, sometimes yes and sometimes no. Right? I think we just have to be really careful because we don't always know what's going on and people are different in how much they show. But Kris, you could probably add better to that question to answer this than I.
Yeah, Sarah, I agree with all that you said. I would say, first I'd love to see folks putting more effort into just training on how to receive a disclosure when it happens in kind of the most simplest ways possible. And then, just talking about survivors are so diverse and disclosures come in a variety of ways and should all be received with kindness and caring.
Vanek asks, can you speak on whether there were negative or positive outcomes that were correlated with good versus bad experiences with criminal or legal interactions? There is, she says, or Vanek says, I know there's some nascent research on the importance of positive social reactions by lawyers and judges and the role of advocates in feeling as if one has received procedural justice. Do you have any more to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we actually did have some survivors in our study who had encounters with police and or with the legal criminal system And they reported some of both. In some cases, they reported that police were supportive and responsive and took their reports seriously. In other cases, you know, there's really negative, bad things that can happen that some survivors experienced with police or with the system. So I think we do have a lot of research on sort of what they call secondary victimization by formal providers, whether they be medical or legal, and that's why we have, right, sexual assault nurse examiners in some hospitals, and why we need to have advocates, right, and that's very important for survivors, especially if they're going to deal with the police and criminal justice process. We didn't ask specifically about that, though, in our interview, so we have less information about that, but you're right, there's more and more research coming out about that, and it's very important, both the police, but also, you're right, actors in the actual criminal legal system, including attorneys and others. This is a big problem where a lot of people, you know, still don't understand this, or still have absorbed, you know, our societal myths, and often kinds of reflect that can actually happen in those processes and contexts.
Right, and similarly, Christina is reporting that she worked with a survivor who was told by the rapist's probation officer that it wasn't a real rape. And she said this is why most people don't come, or so many people don't come forward. We have had a request from Shalane about getting a copy of the alcohol-specific social reaction survey. Should Shalane reach out to you directly, Sarah?
Sure, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm happy to.
And Avery asked, was there any pattern seen between who the offender was, a boyfriend, a family friend, an acquaintance, etc., and the reaction of those who were told, those who received the disclosure?
I don't know if I can say in general, but I mean, I think that, yeah, you know, I can't say that off the top of my head. It does definitely play a role, and it also depends on not just the relationship, but also if that person, the supporter as well, whoever they are, is connected to that individual as well. I do think that, you know, there's always more shock kind of and distress at this being kind of more of a betrayal type where it's somebody close and trusted, or somebody with power, right, direct power over the survivor. But I can't say that I can, from our data, that we have linked that directly in terms of the assault characteristics to support provider responses. But it's a really good question. I think it's really important to look at further. So thank you for asking.
We had two different questions on the same topic, and I think that we can end with this. They're both seeking more examples of positive affirmations to use, or the best method of support for the victim by a supportive person.
Yeah. I would say listening is really important, you know, sort of non-judgmental listening, just giving them that space where they feel like they can say what's happened, and taking cues from them. You know, I mean, this issue of disclosures and what they look like, they vary a lot. Sometimes people indirectly or drop something really small and test the waters and see how that's going to go. Not everybody comes out with a full disclosure and all the detail, or maybe even wants to talk about it. So I think it's a really kind of careful kind of a process where one has to sort of see what's coming and try to respond. And also, I think we can be informed by what we know, if we know that person already in a positive way, in terms of how we know from the experience with them, if we have a relationship with them already, of what works best in responding to them about things in general. Kris may also have a better response to this, but I just think listening.
Yep. Yeah, and you can never go wrong with, I believe you, I care about you, I want to help.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we have had a lot of thank yous, a lot of kudos for this presentation. So Sarah and Kris, thank you so much for sharing your research and your reactions to this important, important topic. It's really important, I think, for all of us working to support survivors to get a better handle on how what we do matters in their healing. So thank you so much. Folks, thank you for staying with us so long today. We're glad that you're showing so much appreciation for our speakers. Do remember to take the feedback survey you're about to receive a link to. And with that, I'm going to close the webinar. Thank you both so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.